Last week, I released my first video about a state-supported passenger rail network here in Utah, and I'm very happy with the reception that received. This is a video that's taken me about a year to prepare and put together, and I showed so much restraint in that video by sticking just to the topic at hand, talking just about trains using the current technologies and what we can expect to be built just right now with the technologies we have, or before the 2034 Winter Olympics. I did not indulge in my second favorite topic, which is autonomous vehicles and how they will change the future of transportation and all the plans that we're making now for infrastructure investments. Autonomous vehicles, in my opinion, will be the greatest transportation revolution, and they deserve a lot of thought and a lot of discussion. And there's been a lot of pushback on that when I've brought this topic up, because one, it is speculation, so anyone could be right or wrong, and what's the point in talking about stuff that isn't here yet? There's some people who believe that it won't make a big change because people drive cars now, they like their cars, and why would I let a computer drive my car for me? And so they don't think that it's going to be a big change. And then there's people who are urbanists or basically anti-car, who think that cars are the antithesis of dense cities that are environmentally sound places. And they have a point that autonomous cars could do things antithetical to that kind of lifestyle. There's going to be a lot more enablement of sprawl in certain locations, but I think there's also going to be a lot more enablement of density and car-free lifestyles as well. Right now we live in this kind of economy where you basically have to have a car if you're going to get around to places in the suburbs. I mean, you can live within a city and never need a car if you don't ever leave the city, but if you're going to go places outside of that city, you do kind of have to own a car in order for any of the economics to work themselves out. And even living in a city, there's places that have parking requirements for apartment buildings or for neighborhoods. And that means that whether you have a car or not, you're paying the extra cost of car infrastructure by having those parking minimum requirements built into the urban environment. And if you have no requirements for parking, or all the concessions to vehicle owners, then you can save a lot of costs on housing, on street design, on the urban environment, and I think a lot more people are going to be able to choose that than not. It's going to be a major transportation revolution. This affects public transportation in many ways. If you are a good, savvy public transit operator who wants to minimize your cost, you're going to look at the single largest cost of your operations, which are humans, your operators, your transit drivers, whether they're train drivers or bus operators or van drivers, whoever. They are the largest single cost, and they're the largest single limitation. They have certain hours they have to work, they have certain hours where they can't work, and so you optimize your system around that major constraint. You have the biggest buses possible, 40-foot buses. These things are only full during rush hours, but you run them all day anyway, because that's your only choice, really. You're not going to have more vehicles available to join in during rush hour. You have what you have, you run them all day. Same with trains, where you can uncouple or couple on more train cars for rush hour, but generally you're going to keep what you have and you're going to run it all day long. You pick trains because, again, you have more passengers compared to the one driver. You have the passenger to operator ratio is very good, and so that's why trains are preferred in some routes to save money. I've had a situation already in my life where I've lived in an economy that has lower costs for drivers. This is the 2 years when I lived as a missionary in Brazil, in the state of Minas Gerais. There, the cost of living is a lot lower, wages are lower, especially for drivers and unskilled labor like that. And it had some interesting applications. The most unique circumstance was the intercity bus trip between the main capital city, Belo Horizonte, and an outlying suburb about an hour away called Sete Lagoas. In order to get to this city, you could take a regular intercity bus line that ran buses every other hour or so, so maybe 8 buses a day, and the bus trip took a certain amount of money, a fixed amount of money, 14, 16 reais, something like that. It wasn't cheap. And you could take that bus, or you could go to the same bus station where that bus departs, and you could catch a taxi. Now you'd think a taxi for an hour ride to a city far away, that's got to cost a lot more. Well, in this case, it cost exactly the same amount. The taxi drivers lined up, They were not really taxis. They were men who owned their own cars. They occupied one seat of the car. The other 4 seats were for passengers. Once all 4 seats were filled, the people paid the same fare for bus as the bus, and then the car would be on its way. And the taxi drivers seem to be doing pretty well for themselves, taking fare from a large bus, but doing it just for themselves in their own little cars. Most Brazilians chose to travel this way between the 2 cities. I don't think I ever took the intercity bus between those 2 cities. It was always by these taxis. And the reason is simple. You don't have to wait for the bus to depart. The cars are there. They are waiting for you. I mean, sometimes there's a little inconvenience when there's too much of a rush and the taxi drivers can't keep up. I think I waited an hour at the most, but otherwise, it's super convenient. And so thinking about that, I have always wondered, how does that compete against not just buses, but against trains? If you have a system in the future where the cost of a driver is so low, perhaps zero, with an autonomous car, that the cars can wait just for you, is there going to be an economic niche in the future for a train to serve the same 2 cities? I think so, yes. One of the things that I thought was interesting about this is that the taxis left just from the rodoviária, the central intercity bus station, and they would go only to the bus station in the other city. They could not go directly from one spot in the big city to the little city or vice versa without paying a much higher fare. Often that fare was higher than the bus fare between the 2 cities because, well, it's a taxi and taxis cost money. And come to think of it, maybe that's how they made their money. But otherwise, as a missionary with no money, we never did that. But in the future, where some large portion of people don't own their own cars, perhaps that is going to be a way that people get between city pairs now, where they go to the main transit hub or some sort of hub where people know to travel, and there will just be cars lined up waiting to take groups of people the long distance. And the larger cost of the longer trip can be offset by the more people being in the car, by not having any wasted seats. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's equivalent to train travel in the future. There's the issue of ticket prices. Ticket prices now generally favor cars because people own their own cars. If you're paying monthly for your vehicle to own it and to maintain it and to operate it, why would you pay for additional money for a transit ticket? That makes no sense. But if you're in the future where you choose between taking a car or taking some other mode of transportation, well, then you have no fixed costs. All the costs are introduced, whether you choose the car or whether you choose the train, and so there will be more preference towards a train than currently there is. Another factor in why people still choose to take the train is the experience of being on the train, the comfort of it. Trains are large, big vehicles. They have a lot of inertia. The ride is very smooth. The grades are generally flat. The speeds are more consistent because they can't start and stop as much. And so it's a lot easier to treat a train as it is like an office, a place where you want to work or watch a movie or have a meal. In the car, it's just a smaller vehicle. It's a bumpier vehicle. It starts and stops a lot more. It's just not going to be the same thing. You're not going to have the same level of comfort. And so if you're talking about trips like we are with our intercity rail system, which can get you from place to place in 2 or 3 or 4 hours, if we're talking, say, Salt Lake City to Moab or Cedar City, 4 or 5 hours, well, people will choose to take either the car and squish in for that amount of time, or they would want to take the train, have the comfier trip for that longer amount of time, and then catch a robotaxi at the very end of the trip. Another factor for trains is that you'd have features on a train, comfort features, that you wouldn't have in an autonomous car, such as restrooms. If you have a trip that's more than an hour or 2 long, you're going to have to schedule certain stops, rest stops, to get out of the car. If you're sharing the vehicle, which of course you would in this taxi scenario, either get restroom time or to have meal service. On a train, you can have a cafe or food service car. Now, you want to scale that up. You want to have at least 100 probably 200 people on a train in order to make that economical, because otherwise you're selling your food at a loss. Not necessarily really at a loss, because the food is probably one of the things that attracted people to the train in the first place, whether they buy it or not. It's one of the things that Amtrak is struggling with these days, to realize that good food is an attraction to get on the train, and whether the food loses money on its own, it still keeps the ticket prices in high demand. And of course, the last thing with autonomous vehicles being good for trains is that trains without a driver can run more frequently and faster. Right now, being a professional train driver, engineer, is a very highly skilled position. It takes a lot of training. There's a lot of regulations around it about how many hours you can work, and the number of crew members it takes to be on a train. When the train operations become completely autonomous, you'd still want to have human crew on board for, say, the wait staff at the cafe food service car, and also conductor and crowd control reasons, especially if you're going to have 200 people on a train, like I would prefer. However, you're not going to have the highly skilled position of running the locomotive and making it work, talking with dispatchers and the like. So you can have more customer-oriented people who are more flexible in what operation hours they can work. So you can have more trains running more frequently at different hours of the day than you could economically right now, where humans have to do all the jobs. And one thing that I really haven't seen speculated a lot about, but I think is pretty obvious to me, is increasing train speeds through tilting the train. Right now, tilt trains are a thing. They are limited in where they can operate, because trains that tilt require a lot of infrastructure beside the track to make it work. Now, there's some trains like the Talgo trains in the Northwest that are passive tilt, where the trains basically hang from a high point above the center of gravity and the trains swing out around a curve. Those are good for about a 10% increase in speed, and they often come with complaints about passengers feeling motion sick because the train is reactive. It doesn't lean into a curve, it basically leans out of a curve, and that's different. It makes people feel like a roller coaster. I'm talking about trains that actively lean, like the Acela train in the Northeast, both the current train and the future train. These trains are guided by wayside signals, by transponders, by loops on the track, and also by GPS nowadays to make sure the train knows where it is. If you're going to tilt, you want to be tilting into the curve before the curve actually starts. As a roadway designer myself, the ratio I use is 2/3 of the tilt needs to be done before the curve, and then 1/3 needs to be done within the curve. And that's the way that it's easiest to design, and it feels the most comfortable for the person driving their car around a curve like that. That's called super elevation. For trains, it's a lot more complicated. In order to minimize the forces as a train hits a curving point, they actually curve into a curve. It's called a spiral curve, and it's very technical to calculate mathematically. But if you were to have an onboard computer trying to figure out how much to curve based on what the computer can see ahead of the train, have cameras ahead of the train looking at the curve and able to map it out, the same way that self-driving cars use cameras to map out, well, then the train can drive itself in real time around a curve like that, and make the curves and the tilts much more optimized. I have read that most active tilting trains can get about a 20% increase in speed around a corner compared to trains that don't. In Europe, they have some that do 30%, and the theoretical maximum percent of speed increase is about 40%. 40% is a big deal. To put that in perspective, if you have a curve that is now 30 miles per hour, a train that's able to go 40% faster around that through tilting, that train can now go 40 miles per hour, 30 to 40. From 45 miles per hour, you can increase to 60 miles per hour. From 60 miles per hour, you can get close to 85 miles per hour. At 80 miles per hour, the current speed limit for a lot of tracks, you can get to 110 miles per hour. And that means that essentially all of the curves on the Wasatch Corridor, the most recent video that I did, none of those curves would need to be realigned the way that I talked about in the video. You could run a fast train at 110 miles per hour on the tracks that we already have, except for a very few locations, such as, Old Town Lehigh. That could go faster than it does now, but not at the full speed. But the point is that you're going to have a lot more trains that can go a lot faster than they do now, and travel times will be significantly reduced for a train that drives on its own. Once you get to your destination, I talked before about robotaxis. That's a major problem. Trains don't go from your front door to the front door of your destination. They go from train station to train station. So how do you get from your front door to the train station and then from the train station to your destination? Well, that's been a problem in the past. You need to have robust public transit networks, and now that's not so much of a concern, or at least now, meaning when you have autonomous vehicles available. And that changes a lot of things about intercity rail, particularly. Airports, because of the high passenger demand, have gotten really built up in their infrastructure for rental cars. Even though rental cars are now, a whole commitment. You rent that car, it stays with you. It's not like a taxi cab that's good for just a ride. It's your car for the whole time, and it's expensive. Yeah, but if you have a train that goes to a city where there is no rental car infrastructure now, it's not going to be nearly the same sort of headache or hassle to have a driverless car come and take you the rest of the way to your destination. And like I said before, if you're traveling a couple hours by train, then it's worthwhile or easy just to get into one of these little cabs for the last couple miles of your trip. One of the original documents Google used to explore whether or not to go and embark on their own self-driving project, which is now Waymo, that project started with a forecast, economic forecast about how cheaply driverless cars could operate. Right now, it generally costs about 40 cents per mile to operate your own car. And that's just based on how many miles a person drives each year, how much time the car spends parked, and maintenance of the mechanical motors and such. Most driverless cars would be electric, just because they'd be used so much. Generally, electric vehicles make a lot more sense when they are able to operate as autonomous cars. Right now, electric vehicles are sort of hitting a ceiling in the amount of customers they have, just because the purchase price is higher. If you want to have more electric vehicles, a lot of people are realizing you have to have them operate in this more robotaxi setting. Otherwise, people are going to stick with the cheapest option, at least as far as purchase price, even though it is so much cheaper to own an electric vehicle than it is to own a gas car. But that's beside the point. The point is that if you have a car that is able to give robotaxi rides, the cost of operating that car, since it operates more time per day, it's down to the single-digit cents per mile, single digits. And so the Google paper even forecast that these robotaxis could essentially be free to use, so long as they had a screen showing advertisements up front, Google's specialty. That it would just be more time to show ads to people, and the car ride itself could be absolutely free between 1 and 2 miles, which I think is just crazy, the economics of how that works. And if you have that way to get people to and from transit stations, not just for low cost or even included in the cost of the train ticket, but absolutely free, that changes a lot of people's thinking, a lot of equations there. The last thing I'm going to talk about is national parks, which hasn't come up as a topic in the series yet, but for the next two cities, Moab and Cedar City, there's going to be a big focus on getting people to the national parks. So there'll be Arches and Zion and Cedar Breaks and the other major national parks in Utah. That's because neither Cedar City nor Moab are really big enough to justify rail service on their own, even when trains are self-driving, autonomous, and all these other bonuses that I've added in on the train side of things. Even when putting those into play, it's still not really enough to justify running a big train out to these small cities, unless you count on a large amount of people going to the national parks there. There's millions of people who go to Arches and Zion National Park, and that's a major travel demand corridor where you can get a lot of people coming from the airport in Salt Lake City to the national parks. Crowding in national parks has made a lot of people very uneasy. The only way to get around in national parks right now is to stop at the toll booth with your car, then drive your car to a trailhead, and then get out, and then go to whatever natural wonder you're looking at, whether it's an arch or a tower or a cliff or a fun hike, a river. It means that there's a lot of area in the national parks that have turned into basically Walmart parking lots, where people are leaving their cars behind, ditching them on this very sensitive natural land, so they can go look at other sensitive natural land, which is crazy to me. If you're going to take the train to a national park, well, there's currently no rental service there now, and so you have no way to get around the parks. Zion National Park has its own shuttle service already, and that's really cool. During certain seasons, during the busiest season, I've been on buses that are absolutely jam-packed and everyone's miserable because they just can't run enough buses to keep up with demand. It's the same problem as before. There's a human operator, and they have a permanent number of people who are staffed, or a seasonal number of people who are staffed, but they can't keep up with the same fluctuations as the demand curve. But with more driverless vehicles, you could have organized shuttle services throughout the parks. You could have disorganized taxi services through the parks. The idea is that visiting a national park now would become more expensive to do with your own private vehicle. You have like an extra tax that you pay just by, or toll that you pay to take your personal car into the national park because, well, it's your car, which means that while you're busy in the park, there's going to be either a spot where your car is taking up space in a parking lot, or you send your car away for a while. Well, then it's just driving around the national park, taking up road space. So no matter what's going on, your car is taking up space separate from you. Whereas if you have a robotaxi service within the national park or a shuttle service, those vehicles are doing work while you're out recreating and making it more efficient. The amount of lost space due to vehicles or parking is lower. So taking a train to the entrance of a national park and then getting on either the shuttle or taxi service at the national park is going to be a much more common way for people to take to visit and experience the national parks. Right now, in the scripts for the upcoming videos, I'm showing between 5 and 10% of park passengers, park visitors arriving by train. I think it's going to be a lot higher than that in the future. Just putting on my speculative hat for looking ahead at how people are going to treat or consider national parks in the future. I think it would be strange if more than half of the people show up to national parks in some way that isn't public transit or some sort of transportation service, whether that's a rented a driverless car, or whether that's a bus, or whether that's a train. And that just means that there's going to be a huge untapped market of potential people to take around the state of Utah, since we are surrounded by national parks, mostly on the south, some in the north, not to give too much away. But those are my very disorganized thoughts about upcoming technology improvements to taking the train, and why I am not concerned for the future of passenger rail. I am very excited about the future of passenger rail in the country for those reasons that I listed before. Also that private passenger rail markets are growing. Brightline is one. There's a few other things happening. An overnight train that's trying to start service in California between Los Angeles and San Francisco. A few other instances as well. When there's more demand for the rail service part due to either the robotaxis or just because the costs become lower on the train side of things, self-driving trains, we're going to see a lot more of that, where it's a lot more of a business to run a train, where the trains are going to run for the first time at a profit. First time in at least 50 years where trains have become seen as a profitable business. And then it's going to be much more like what you see nowadays, where you have private bus companies, many different ones, and they run on public roads. They pay a regular toll, a regular fee to the government to use their public facilities, and the private people do the service that the customers see and use. Right now, our railroad tracks are owned by private companies. Maybe those will be the same companies that try and offer rail service, passenger rail service in the future. Or maybe with some public investment, we can have a situation similar to the roads, where you have corridors that are shared between public and private, where freight rail or passenger rail, one or the other owns it and the other has trackage rights. And that way you can have the passenger rail authority keep and maintain the tracks up to a standard up to 110 miles per hour, even 125 miles per hour. You know, most countries that say they have high-speed rail or fast passenger trains, 125 miles an hour is a very common speed for that. That's about 200 kilometers per hour, and that makes it sound so much faster, doesn't it? Kilometers per hour. But anyway, between 110 and 125 miles per hour, that requires some extra maintenance to keep the track smooth and level in a way that it doesn't, the freight trains operators don't generally do. But if you had the passenger rail authority take ownership of that aspect of it and then have different private operators pay that authority, you could have a system very similar to, say, like buses or airlines, where you get to the train station and it's not just one train company having a monopoly on the system, where you have multiple operators. You can choose which company you want to ride with that day, which operator of the trains you're going to run with. And that's going to be a fantastic future to live in. That's the one that I want, the one that has choices in transportation, freedom to figure out not just which mode to take, but which service and level of service I want. And I see that being common in the future. I think that by working now to do things like the Rio Grande plan and the statewide passenger rail network, Linktree, Utah, we would have a fantastic foundation for building a future like that. And that makes me very excited. So yeah, those are my very disorganized, scattered thoughts about passenger rail that I did not include in the main videos and will not. I commit. If I indulge, you let me know. Anyway, thanks for listening to my speculation on the future. I'm Christian Lenhart. Thank you for watching.